Welcome to this special episode of the Informing Choices Minipod, produced in collaboration with One Day in 2050. Ecofascism, Leviathan or Lifejacket of Humankind is a multi-author book featuring 36 top futurist voices who have come together to explore our climate future beyond purely climate data through the lens of ecofascism. But what is ecofascism? Ecofascism is a political ideology that merges elements of environmentalism with authoritarianism or fascism. It often involves a belief that environmental problems are caused by overpopulation, immigration, industrialization, and that these issues can be addressed through restrictive policies and even violence against marginalized groups. The premise for all the stories in the book is this. The year is 2050. Temperatures have risen by over 2 degrees Celsius. Global population has reached 9.8 billion. Pressure on natural systems is at its peak. A new global movement has arisen. A totalitarian system has been enforced based on the minimum climate footprint on every aspect of our society. Today, we welcome futurist, economist, strategist and trend analyst Bronwyn Williams to talk about her chapter in the book. Bronwyn, welcome to the podcast. Your chapter, Jack's Dogs or Jack's Baby, is about a woman's dilemma, having a baby or keeping the dogs, as the state strictly controls personal energy consumption. Talk us through your chapter. What story are you telling here?
Yeah, well, I mean, the whole premise of the book, Ecofascism, was really starting with a scenario that we needed to work towards. I know some people already have seen previews of the book have said, why is this so doom and gloom and all the rest of it? Well, that was the scenario we started with. And the scenario is just a possible picture. And in this case, I think it's a plausible scenario or snapshot of what our future could be like. And the purpose of the book was, of course, to get different people's opinions as to how such a scenario could play out in a bit more of a nuanced human perspective, right? So we all just took a particular angle or a slice, but of the same scenario to build up a picture of a possible, but not a predetermined world. So I think that's important to sort of premise all of these conversations. And given the brief, well, what we do as futurists is we look at signals in the real world and then try to play out how they would roll out in this kind of a scenario. And I would say this kind of scenario is almost a kind of continuation scenario based on already in progress trends. So some of the trends that we looked at, or I looked at when I was putting it together there, some of the signals we looked at to bring this particular chapter to light were things like the personalization of carbon credit scores, things that have started quite subtly, like when you book an airline flight, it says, would you like to offset your carbon and pay a little bit of extra there? What's effectively happening there is we're starting to get a pricing mechanic for carbon consumption, which is almost a second price layer. So I see this as all kind of being collectively, to use inverted commas, kind of social credit scores that track the energy and the consumption and the resources that you are using, the externalities, as well as the market price of the goods and services that we are consuming, which in some ways is completely fair. And it certainly seems to be one of those future predictions that is rolling out more and more every year. There were other signals that I also drew from there, the likes of companies, particularly in Europe, trying to offset their own carbon credit scores, where again, personalizing them and putting those scores or those carbon credits or anti-credits onto their employees. Doing things like finding out where employees are living. Are employees living when they're working remotely in buildings that are energy secure with double glazed windows, for example? Or when they go to in-person meetings, are those employees using public transport or using their cars, right? So all of this means that there's an increasing obligation for the individual to both account for, to track their own cost to society, and to then share that with stakeholders, whether those stakeholders be companies or governments. As I said, these are sort of signals playing out in the real world. Other signals that I drew from that weren't to do with the sort of carbon credit score, social credit obligation, that's certainly a progressing trend at the moment, were, of course, the conversations around women's rights. And I think it's quite interesting, particularly when it comes to this particular book, how many people, how many futurists wrote about the changing expectations and the changing rights that women have over their own bodies. And I think this is a conversation that, of course, you can't escape anywhere, but certainly there has been a lot of so-called gender backlash or regression on terms of the autonomy of women's bodies. So I think that's worth paying attention to. So my essay came at it from a slightly different angle, from like straight up reproductive rights, but rather question it in terms of almost reproductive rights and responsibilities, but still this idea that society has a say in which babies are born or not, and how women's bodies are tracked or not is something that I think is already unfolding in our world. And then some other sort of left of field signals, things like growing conversations around the rights of people to have pets at all, because pets do consume energy. They are another mouth to feed effectively. And even when we see things like what have been playing out this week with the devastating hurricanes going on in the United States. I mean, I'm coming to you, for those of you who aren't in the same timeline and space as me, from like, October in 2024, where there have been some really devastating hurricanes. And you hear many terrible stories about people having to choose between leaving their pets or leaving their children behind. We also hear stories of governments trying to say that pets should be rationed, that perhaps pets should be banned because of the impact on the environment, because of the costs that they have, because they're just adding extra carbon emissions, even if they are still providing some sort of intrinsic value. Do we have a right as individuals to overshoot our own endowments? And these are sort of some of the questions we're grappling with. On a bigger level, I'm sure many people sort of recognize the whole sort of limits to growth idea, the idea that they are scarce resources, that there are finite resources, and that society as a whole is an allocation problem. Who gets access to those things, to those finite resources? Who gets to control them? Who gets to price them? These are questions that every society grapples with really all the time, and the trade-offs thereof. So hopefully we just sort of provoked a few questions there by humanizing and personalizing really a lot of the economic dilemmas that politicians and NGOs debate and deal with on a daily basis.
One of the things I find absolutely fascinating about your story, and most of the stories that have come across in the book, is the ability and willingness, the almost inevitability that one of the things that we do as futurists is kind of join all these different dimensions together. So while you were talking there, you were talking about enterprise, you were talking about the social pressures, you were talking about society, economics, and you were talking about infrastructure, politics. And what I find really interesting, the piece that perhaps some people might have been expecting in there that's missing, is technology. But I think that just re-emphasizes that actually, technology is just one of these other tools. But the really important stuff is there's all this other stuff you've talked about.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like I definitely would say when it comes to futurism, I would say I'm an anti-technology futurist. That's not to say I'm anti-technology, but rather I'm anti the practice of centering technology in our view of the future. Because technology, when it works, is in fact invisible. And good literature, whether you're reading books from the 1600s or whether you're reading books from today, doesn't make the technology explicit. There's a sort of assumption that people know how technology works in the characters' lives. But when you start spelling it out, the telephones, the software, the hardware, not only does your story age a lot quicker than a story that's centered on human beings, that has like less relevance and resonance with people, but also you're focusing on the wrong things. So I think quite often, certain types of futurism, and quite often pop futurism and futurism in the media, perhaps the less sort of academic sort, does center technology, because technology seems like it's exciting and it's shiny and there's always something new happening. But so much of that is noise, and it's trendy rather than deep trend as to how society is moving. Even in my story, there's the subtext of technology, in that none of the plot points or the frictions in the little story would be possible without a ubiquitous technological surveillance system, which the character doesn't explicitly talk about, but rather it's assumed to be there. So it's there, but it's not explicitly mentioned. I don't think we make a mistake following technology. So I think that so much about technology lags society, lags inspiration, lags the stories that we tell, rather than really leads. And again, the other point is that we can make a lot of really big mistakes when it comes to trying to predict what technology will be in the future. Whereas if we are in the business, and we're not supposed to be explicitly in the business of prediction, or in the business of futurism, but we are trying to make plausible scenarios and stories, we have a much better chance of nailing it if we focus on the human and the political dynamics, which tend to be much slower moving and much more consistent trends. As good old Voltaire said, history doesn't rhyme, but it or doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme, and it has a jolly good rhythm section, right? And that rhythm, that human heartbeat, is much more often found in interpersonal relationships and in our needs and our desires and our conflicts, which haven't actually changed that much. What has changed is the ability to monitor and measure and manage those things.
I was going to ask you, what was the motivation behind your chapter, but have you started to answer that in the way that you've clearly differentiated the technology from the human?
Yeah, I suppose so. I think the motivation to write it was just that it was an interesting challenge. It was interesting that it was going to be one scenario with many different brains all coming at it, and everyone bringing their own view on how that particular world, which was very lightly defined by the organizers of this project, could play out. And that's, of course, exciting to be a part of. And I think the most interesting parts, as I mentioned earlier, were how many things people coming from very diverse parts of the world and very different worldviews and very different values as to whether they liked the scenario or didn't like the scenario, how many of the things we spoke about were consistent among so many of us.
Yeah.
Which was surprising to me when you read the final product. You were like, oh, everybody's picked up on these same sorts of threads. So it kind of makes it interesting to see what people assume to be the de facto future, even though it hasn't been explicitly laid out for us. That's not what the future does, but how so much of the subtext and the conversation coming through from media, from politics, from conversations has seeped down into our collective subconscious. And I think that's both a warning and a comfort to us. It's comforting that we all kind of see the same things, but it is quite frightening when you start to challenge that a bit further and see how accepting we are of so many of these things, many of which will make us feel quite uncomfortable. Yeah. So when it comes to these sorts of de facto or assumed futures or the inevitable rollout of certain programs or certain worldviews, I think that, again, coming back to your question as to what the sort of motivation here is to make people feel uncomfortable about those assumptions and to open up just a little bit of space to say, if that makes you feel uncomfortable, what are you going to do to resist those threats? Or are you going to be sort of passive passenger into the future? And again, because so many of us picked up on the same sorts of threads, and because the future is made by our collective choices every single day, if people are reading essays and books like this and not doing something to challenge those now revealed to be quite common perceptions as to where we're headed, now you are personally responsible. You no longer have the luxury of opting out, much like the Roko's basilic kind of conversation, right? Once you've seen it, now it's your responsibility to kind of do something about it. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, it certainly does. I think it is fascinating. You kind of pinpointed the wonderful kind of coming together of similarities and differences in the book, and I guess that's where you get that. Oh, we can kind of coalesce around some of these things, but the differences represent perhaps the challenges that we face. And again, I think you've started to answer this with how uncomfortable maybe people will feel when posed the kind of so what question. But what do you want readers to do, to consider, to think about after reading your chapter?
Firstly, feel what they want to feel. Like, read these stories and say, do they make you feel good? Do they make you feel frightened? Do they make you feel angry? And then interrogate those feelings, right? Because are those feelings like underpinned by helplessness, by inevitability? Are those feelings underpinned by just fundamental disagreement in politics? Why are you feeling the things that you are feeling? And if it is based on a lack of agency, what can you do to change that? And if it is based on an othering or on more sort of political debates, again, there's so many platforms to get involved with changing and challenging that conversation. So if these sorts of things can turn feelings into action in any sorts of way, I think we've gone a large way to doing something useful, which is often unfortunately, that's the reality, the problem with us in the futures industry. A lot of interesting things, but how useful and impactful are we really? And I'm a big believer that stories, that words, that visceral pictures of the future, and the organizers again did put together pictures, much as they are AI generated, are some of the most fundamental levers for changing society. Because stories can be attacked, they can be debated, they can be visions that we want to work towards, or again, they can be pictures of things that we want to avoid. But quite often you need to name and frame a problem before you are able to really identify what is making you feel, as I said, the way that you're feeling: excited, happy, disappointed, frustrated, angry, helpless. And once you're able to describe it, once you're able to frame that feeling, you're then able to start to formulate policies or actions or choices that can make you feel empowered again.
Bronwyn, that's been absolutely brilliant. You've really beautifully, I think, focused on this human element, but then put that into the context about what many futurists, I think, would hope they're able to do with the things that they talk about, the things that they write, and the things that they project into the wider world. So, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any other episodes of this series of podcasts on ecofascism. And of course, all our other episodes on the Informing Choices mini pod. Do let your friends and colleagues know about the podcast, and there'll be another episode along very soon.